Hi, this is Drew Horton, Enology Specialist for the University of Minnesota's Grape Breeding and Enology Project. And this is part one of vineyard sampling for fruit quality and maturity in the field. One cannot reasonably expect to make high quality wine from underripe or otherwise low quality fruit. Between veraison and up until the time you're ready to harvest, you should observe the vineyard frequently in order to monitor fruit quality and to help you decide when to harvest. Consider the health and condition of the vineyard as a whole, the vines themselves, and the clusters. It's important to tour the vineyard often during ripening in order to observe conditions and any developing trends or problems. Always remember this saying: the best thing for a vineyard are the footprints of the winemaker. Try to look at the vineyard as a whole within its immediate environment, from a macro to a micro scale, and determine if there are any pest or disease pressures. Are there any obvious pest issues, such as insect, bird, or mammal activity? Are there any diseases like mildew, mold, or rot occurring? Observe the vines, the leaves, and the tendrils. Are all the leaves green, or are they starting to turn color? Are the leaves starting to shrivel, dry out, roll, or droop? What about the tendrils? Are they still green and firm, or are they starting to wilt and wither? All of these observations can provide clues to vineyard health and fruit development and ripeness. When leaves turn color and begin to droop, that is a sign the vine may be slowing down sugar and flavor development. Drooping tendrils can be a sign of water stress. The top left image here is Japanese beetle damage. The top right is botrytis, and the lower image is downy mildew. In general winemaking terms, riper is better, but overripe can be bad too. It's important to monitor the physical and sensory development of the crop throughout the ripening period. Are the clusters developing normally? Are there any disease or pest issues? Was there a poor fruit set? Do you see lots of shot berries? Is there bird or insect damage or damage from weather, wind, or hail? Do you notice a lot of variability in the condition of the clusters, or are they all very similar in size and ripeness? Variability in cluster development can lead to uneven ripening, making it difficult to time the harvest because some of the fruit may be perfectly ripe, but some may be underripe and some overripe. One of the problems with overripeness is field oxidation, and signs of this are grapes starting to dry out, shrivel, or show raisoning. An unripe fruit, besides being low in sugar, may have underdeveloped and green flavors, or be bitter or thin. Tasting the vineyard can be as important as testing the vineyard. Remember to use your many senses: sight, touch, smell, and taste. Did you know you can actually smell sour rot and mold issues while in the vineyard? Sour rot has a vinegar-like smell, and mold smells, well, like mold. Taste the grapes for sweetness, acidity, and maturing flavor development. Observe the condition of the seeds. Less ripe seeds will be wet and green. Riper seeds will start to turn brown, dry out, and get crunchy when you chew them. It's not uncommon to chew the skins and seeds, and when you do, you may perceive astringency or tannin. Keep in mind, there are winemakers who decide when to harvest based only on their experience and their sensory perceptions, and who rarely check the chemistry. The goal when sampling a vineyard is to get a representative, random sample that reflects the average condition, quality, and ripeness of the entire crop at a given time or date. In most cases, there are two different techniques for sampling a vineyard. One is called berry sampling, and the other is cluster sampling. In cluster sampling, you pick whole clusters of grapes, 20 to 30 clusters is preferable, but up to 40 is best on larger vineyards or larger vineyard blocks. In berry sampling, you need to pick at least 100 berries, but 200 to 300 is even better. When berry sampling, you want to be careful to pick 4 berries per cluster, one from the top of the cluster, one from the bottom, one from the middle outward-facing side of the cluster, and one from the middle inward-facing side of the cluster. Each technique is different and has its own individual advantages and disadvantages. In general, it's a good idea not to sample from rows on the ends or edges of the vineyard, because they can be riper than the rest. Don't sample vines on the ends of rows either. Start at least 5 vines in from the end of a row. In general, vines near the edges of a block or the ends of rows may be riper than the rest of the crop. Be careful to remember to sample from both sides of the rows. And remember that it's best to collect samples in the cool of the morning, because a hot sample picked in the afternoon can provide inaccurate results due to the higher sample temperature. Keep in mind that your eyes are often likely to be attracted to the largest and best-looking grapes or clusters, so the best technique of collecting samples is to not look at what you are sampling. Use the so-called flying blind technique. With the so-called flying blind technique, the idea is to not look at the clusters, or the clusters from which you want to sample berries, thus removing any sampling bias towards the biggest or best looking or the most colorful clusters. It's done like this. While walking along the middle of a row, look to one side only, while pointing to the other side where you are not looking. In other words, if you're pointing to the right, you should be looking towards the left. Now stop walking at random times with your pointing hand out, but not looking in the direction your hand is pointing. While stopped, now look at your pointing hand and sample the cluster of grapes closest to your pointing finger. If you find your finger pointing exactly between 2 clusters, either sample them both or sample neither and keep flying down the row. Let's consider some of the advantages and disadvantages of berry sampling and cluster sampling. A berry sample weighs less than a cluster sample and is easier to carry around a vineyard when walking. It's also easier to crush 100% of the berries because the berries are easier to see and crush when there are no stems in the way. A berry sample can be weighed throughout ripening to track berry growth and increasing berry weight. Likewise, weighing a berry sample can also show grape shrinkage due to dehydration or desiccation toward the end of the ripening period. Berry sampling works well with loose clusters where individual berries are easy to collect. And finally, berry sampling uses less total fruit than cluster sampling. A few of the disadvantages to berry sampling are the possibility of sampler bias to collect only the largest or best colored berries, or a sampler bias to collect only berries that are easy to collect on the top or bottom of the cluster, and not equally from the middle and the inward part of the cluster. Keep in mind in the early part of the season that samples that are not very ripe may not provide a large enough juice sample for analysis. Cluster sampling assures that the sample is representative of all parts of the cluster and helps to avoid sampler bias towards top and bottom of clusters or only the best-looking berries. Cluster samples can also be weighed, recorded, and compared throughout the ripening period to assist in the prediction of the total crop yield. Cluster sampling also works well with varieties that have tightly compact clusters, where berry sampling can be more difficult or destructive to the clusters left on the vine after sampling. Crushing and dejuicing 100% of the berries from 20 or more clusters is more time and labor intensive, and may require a small crusher and even a small press. Keep in mind that any sampler bias in favor of collecting only healthy and large clusters, while ignoring small or sunburned clusters, can affect sample accuracy. Make sure to follow the flying blind technique. And lastly, cluster sampling uses more total fruit, and this may be a consideration for very small vineyards or smaller vineyard blocks. Tools and equipment needed for vineyard sampling are easy and cheap. 1-gallon Ziploc bags work well for berry sampling, and you can crush the sample with your hands right in the bag, though a 300 berry sample may be too big. Do be careful when sampling berries not to be destructive to the clusters still on the vine. A 3 or 5-gallon plastic bucket works well for cluster sampling. Use a picking fork or shears to collect whole clusters. Don't just rip the clusters off by hand. Clusters can be easily crushed or pre-macerated in the bucket prior to pushing the juice through a strainer or through a small press. Keep in mind you should try to collect samples in the coolest parts of the day, because most refractometers, hydrometers, and pH meters are calibrated to be used at 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. A juice sample that is warmer than 20 Celsius or 68 Fahrenheit will give lower than actual results. For example, when measuring juice for bricks, a warm 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degree Fahrenheit sample will read 0.7 degrees Brix lower than actual. And when testing for pH, a 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degree Fahrenheit sample will read 0.06 lower than actual. Preferred equipment includes pH meters and digital refractometers that have built-in temperature compensation. However, temperature compensation tables are easy to find online and can be used to account for warm sample reading discrepancies. So now you've got your samples. Let's take them into the lab. Please proceed to Part 2 in the lab, where we will discuss how to test your samples once you collect them.